There is never a dull moment in Starbase these days. This week was no exception, as we had loads of activity at SpaceX's second launch facility at their South Texas launch site. We've got lots of tank farm work, more progress on the launch mount, the flame bucket, and of course, the big item of the week, the chopsticks. As you can imagine, there has also been a ton of work on Pad A in terms of repairs and refurbishment after Flight 7. Additionally, we've got some more progress on future vehicles at the production site, and there's even more Starship news, but from here on the Space Coast of Florida. I'm Max Evans with NSF, and this is your Starbase Update. Starting off on Pad A, the work here has been continuous on repairs and refurbishment since Booster 14 left the launch mount last week and went to the production site following another successful catch. As we've seen after previous flights, work begins by reinstalling the scaffolding and booster alignment pins back on the orbital launch mount. The scaffolding allows workers to access critical areas of the launch mount for inspections and refurbishment ahead of the next flight. Like, for example, the booster's quick disconnect umbilical. The umbilical connects the Super Heavy booster and provides it with all propellant, power, and data that it needs to function. It's not unusual for this quick disconnect to get quite toasty after each flight, and with it being such a critical piece of hardware, the post-flight inspections and repairs are more than justified. The guiding pins, on the other hand, are located on the top deck of the mount that allows SpaceX to carefully position a booster on the launch mount using the chopsticks. These carefully nudge the aft end of the booster left or right for a precise alignment with all of the clamps and quick disconnects for the outer 20 Raptor engines. And because they're on top of the mount, they have to come off right before each flight to avoid receiving damage or getting fried to oblivion. Their reinstallation signals that it's time for the next booster, likely Booster 15, to head to the launch site for engine testing. As we'll see later in the episode, testing could be just a few short weeks away. We've also seen workers around the bottom of the legs taking a look at the water-cooled steel plate used during launch, likely inspecting and repairing whatever needs to be. As usual, we also got the return of the work platform at the launch mount, often nicknamed the dance floor. This allows workers access to the internal side of the launch ring where all of the clamps and umbilicals for the outer ring of Raptor engines lies. Now, usually in the days following a Starship launch is the release of official mission footage from SpaceX. The company went all in, sharing all sorts of imagery from the launch, and in particular, the booster catch. For example, there's this incredible super slow-mo view of liftoff, likely shot from the tower, looking closely at the business end of Booster 14 and the Raptor's exhaust plume. This, of course, was just the appetizer, as SpaceX also treated us to imagery of the booster catch, including one angle close to the pad where we can see Booster 14's 3 center Raptor engines blasting their exhaust against the launch tower base. In addition to the footage, SpaceX also shared information relating to the booster landing, which had some differences to how Booster 12 performed on Flight 5. SpaceX stated on X that the landing burn start was only 40 meters off target, and mind you, this was after traveling to the edge of space and back. Critically, the wind speeds for this super heavy landing burn were the highest yet performed in so far, and that apparently, quote, upgrades to the chopstick controls enabled them to start wider and move earlier for each catch, expanding the envelope for booster landing burn trajectories. So this sounds like SpaceX was trying a more aggressive landing for Super Heavy on this flight, which is fascinating considering this was only the second time a booster had approached the launch site from above. Now imagine how optimized the landing approach could be after 20, 40, 100, or even 1,000 catches down the line. Despite SpaceX sharing this footage and information, unfortunately, we still don't have any further information on what caused Ship 33's demise other than what was said by Elon and the company itself soon after the flight. In previous occasions, SpaceX usually announced this kind of information when it was close to the next flight or when it had completed the mishap investigation, which should be well underway by now for Flight 7. We'll be sure to keep an eye out for any sort of updates as they come, including what kinds of changes may be needed for Flight 8's vehicle, Ship 34, and when that flight may be. Now at this point in the video, you might be wondering why you're stuck with me this week. Well, that's because Jack is at Tim Dodd the Everyday Astronaut's Astro Awards in Austin, Texas. Not jealous at all. The weather has been rough at best. Not entirely surprising given it's winter here in the northern hemisphere, but last week saw a particularly strong storm that swept through the southern US. That storm left unusual amounts of snow on the Gulf Coast, including northern Florida and in the Panhandle. Yeah, snow. Thankfully, none of that snow made it to Starbase, and definitely not here on the Space Coast. Just lots of rain and lots of wind instead. Rough weather at Starbase unfortunately means that there is less solar power available to our camera sites, so we have to go and feed them with a fresh battery every now and then, so you can continue to enjoy our 24/7 Starbase live stream. But as you can imagine, weather affects not just our hardware, but SpaceX's as well. The weather at Starbase meant a lot of work at the launch site had to be put on hold until the storm had passed, as well as a lot of the construction equipment for Pad B having to be secured. The storm also did some damage to the mural that SpaceX installed a few months ago at the production site's multi-level parking garage. While Starship may eventually be fully reusable, this mural, not so much. In some more positive news, despite the weather, SpaceX was still able to make progress on future vehicles for flight, as well as moving certain hardware around the production site. One of the things that we got to see at the production site was the delivery of a booster transfer tube to Mega Bay 1. Maybe if you're an avid tank watcher, you might know what this is for, but if you're not, here's usually what we often do to see what kind of hardware is being delivered. First, we go through what vehicles are currently in the Mega Bay. We've got Booster 14, which returned after its catch on Flight 7. Then we've got Booster 15, which has already undergone cryogenic proof testing, followed by Booster 16, which is also fully stacked, but is yet to undergo any testing. And then we have Booster 17's liquid oxygen tank, which has started stacking inside of the Mega Bay a few weeks ago. So given the fact that 14, 15, and 16 are complete, and therefore already have their booster transfer tubes installed, this is most likely for Booster 17's liquid oxygen tank. The transfer tube is essentially a big tube that allows the liquid methane to flow from the bottom of the liquid methane tank through the liquid oxygen tank and down to the engine section, where it's sent to all 33 engines via a manifold. Usually the installation of this transfer tube is the last step before the booster's engine section rolls into the bay and gets welded to the bottom of the liquid oxygen tank. So given that, we'll have to keep an eye out and see if that booster engine section rolls out soon, and if there may be any changes to this particular one, given that it's an unfinished booster. Once that barrel section is welded to the LOX tank, the bottom half of the booster will be completed, and SpaceX will then move to building the top half of the booster, which is primarily composed of the liquid methane tank section. Once both halves are complete, they'll be stacked and a new booster will be born. While mating both halves of the booster completes the structure of the vehicle, there are a lot of smaller bits that need to be installed on the exterior and the interior. Most of this hardware is critical to making the booster work as intended, so it gets installed prior to the vehicle's cryogenic proof testing. But other, less critical hardware is often installed later, such as the booster's grid fins. This week, SpaceX staged grid fins in front of the Mega Bay and were later moved inside. Given that Booster 15 didn't have any grid fins around a week ago, and that's supposed to be used on Flight 8, these grid fins are likely destined for Booster 15. This booster has already completed cryogenic proof testing a few weeks ago and should be preparing for its engine test campaign at the launch site. This involves having to install all 33 Raptor engines at the aft end of the booster and fitting it with the usual engine shields as well. With recent boosters, the installation of the grid fins had taken place somewhat close to the start of that engine test campaign, so hopefully we shall get to see that soon. Now there's a small but non-zero chance that these grid fins could be for Booster 14. Just like with Booster 12, Booster 14's grid fins were warped a bit during hot staging due to the ship's engine exhaust, so the reuse doesn't seem that likely at the moment. Since these are made of simple steel panels, it wouldn't take that much time and cost to remanufacture a new set, and who knows? Maybe SpaceX is thinking about reflying Booster 14, and they might need a new set of grid fins for that. Thankfully, if the renders are correct, this grid fin warping won't be an issue with the Block 2 version booster, since the grid fins won't be as close to the hot staging ring as they are right now. Going from boosters to ships, this week saw delivery of a ship flap to the production site. On this image that Mary took, we can see a label saying Ship NY Forward Flap, indicating that this is a ship forward flap. Precisely, this one should be mounted on the left-hand side of the ship when viewed from its leeward section. We know this because the NY in that label refers to the negative y-axis of the ship's own coordinate system, which is based on that side. Just like with previous hardware, in order to have a solid guess as to what this might be for, we have to think about what the ship's status is at the production site. Ship 34 is completed, already having its forward flaps, and while Ship 35 is not complete yet, it does have its forward flaps installed. Ship 36's nose cone inside of the Starfactory also appears to have its flaps installed. Now, there's a good chance that this forward flap might be for Ship 37, if not for a later vehicle. Another bit of hardware that was seen roaming around the production site was Test Tank 16. This tank was built a while ago, and it is made up of a Block 2 ship aft section and another barrel on top with stringers. This test article was used to certify the design of the Block 2 ship aft section, having gone through testing at the structural test stand at Massey's. By the way, if you're wondering why we call it Test Tank 16, it's because there are no visible labels showing a proper name, and it is the 16th test tank we've observed at Starbase. After it completed testing a while ago, it was rolled from Massey's to the Sanchez lot, where it has been sitting for a while now. This week, however, the test tank was moved from Sanchez to the production site and into Starfactory. We don't exactly know why this could be, but maybe SpaceX still has plans for it. After all, it was how they qualified the aft section of the Block 2 ships, and if what doomed Ship 33 on Flight 7 was in the aft section of the ship, perhaps they're using it to validate any hypotheses. They could also be using it to practice on how to modify a ship aft section with the needed upgrades before they go and retrofit Ship 34 before its own flight. Or maybe none of this is happening and it's getting scrapped. As usual, we aren't 100% sure, but we'll see what ends up happening. The star of the show this week, though, has been the Chopsticks and the carriage system for the second launch facility at Starbase, Pad B. You may recall from last week that SpaceX had rolled the carriage system for Tower 2 out to the launch site. There it was installed on the red chopstick jig that's used to align the chopsticks with the carriage system. Well, this week we got the arms themselves going down Highway 4 and out to the launch site for installation on the carriage. While they were at the pad, we were able to see all of the details on the arms, including the hardware that's going to be used for lifting and catching vehicles at the pad, ships and boosters. In general terms, these arms are very much like the ones at Pad A, just a bit shorter. For example, the arms still have a similar geometry compared to those at Pad A. They also have access platforms at the top, so teams can work up close with the hardware when needed. The arms also have a landing rail for the boosters and ships to land on, albeit a bit shorter since the arms are shorter, of course. We can also see the pins on each end of the landing rails that help adjust the vehicles while they sit stationary on them. These are essential, especially after a catch, in order to line up the booster right where it needs to be so that it can then be put down on the launch mount accurately. The mechanism is very simple. If both move in the same direction, you get a vehicle translation along the rail, and if you move them in the opposite directions, you can control the roll of the vehicle along the rail. We can also see that the landing rails have bumper pads just like the ones at Pad A that help cushion the impact on the arms as they slap against the side of the vehicles during a catch. As we've seen over the past few months, the chopsticks were also fitted with structural reinforcements. Now, if you're wondering, hang on, why are they shorter than the Pad A chopsticks? Well, there are at least two good reasons why. The first is very simple. The arms don't need to be as long as they were for Pad A. The end section of the arms is never used, so if there's a way to simplify the system, shortening the arms seems like a no-brainer. The second reason is that by being shorter, they're lighter and therefore easier to move and also to stop. Remember, the best part is no part. The arms need to close quickly around a vehicle, which means the movement needs to be swift and efficient. When they stop moving, that halt in motion needs to be as smooth as possible. A much easier task with shorter and lighter arms. This isn't to say that Pad A's arms don't work well, because obviously they do. It's just that the shorter arms are designed to work better in the long run. If there was any worry about the length of the landing rail being an issue for catch reliability, both Booster 12 and Booster 14 were caught on the arms closer to the tower, well within the length of the shorter arms now. Now, the process of installing the chopsticks on the tower is quite tricky. It requires a lot of crane work and, most importantly, patience. As mentioned before, first, teams need to put the carriage system on the chopstick jig. This allows them to have the whole carriage and chopstick system in the same orientation, making it easier for them to be installed on the tower. Then, each of the chopstick arms needs to be rigged to a different crane for lifting. At Starbase, this was done using SpaceX's LR-11000 crane and the Buckner LR-11000 crane. Once the chopsticks are lifted and resting on the other chopstick jig, they need to be aligned with the carriage system. The chopsticks and carriage system are then joined and secured using a giant pin which keeps everything secured and in one place, kind of like a big master pin that keeps everything together. Once that's completed, teams secure the chopsticks to the carriage system so they don't swing and flap around freely when they're lifted onto the tower. Meanwhile, on the tower itself, workers also have to install the skates where the carriage system will be installed onto. These skates will then roll up and down the tower via rails that had already been installed on 3 of its 4 corners. This hardware needs to be in place and secured by the time of the big lift. That's when the whole carriage and chopstick system is lifted off of the jig and then moved onto the tower, where teams carefully align the carriage with the skates and secure it. The skates were installed last week, so they have that checked off. At the time of recording, both chopsticks have been lifted and teams have also installed the master pin as well. The chopsticks are now secured to the carriage system, and the lift for installation of the tower could happen at any moment. It's likely that by the time you're watching, they're already installed, so feel free to go ahead and check out Starbase live and maybe let us know in the comment section down below if that's the case. Work at Pad B has not just been throughout the chopsticks though. Work is ongoing as its own tank farm is being installed, upgrading it to support operations from there, hopefully soon. As we've seen in previous weeks, there continues to be a lot of digging in front of and next to the ground storage tanks, likely as a part of the efforts to move a lot of the piping and wiring underground. This also includes the work laying out the cryogenic piping that goes into Pad B. Some of these pipes being delivered and installed are huge. For example, this one, which says it's about 36 inches wide. It's about 90 centimeters, or about half the height of a Starship stainless steel ring. We've also seen this past week the delivery of crates with the logo of a German company called
Rohrpumpen.
I can't say it, so it's right here, which specializes in manufacturing pumps for industrial applications. So it's likely that these crates contain the pumps that deliver all of the propellants and fluids from the tank farm out to Pad B. This week we also saw the delivery of even more vaporizers to the tank farm, even though they already have about a dozen of them on site. I mean, in this view alone, there's about 9 of them. Some of the work with Pad B though is not happening at the launch site. At the Sanchez lot, SpaceX continues to work on the launch mount that will be installed at Pad B. Compared to just a few weeks ago, it seems like workers have installed a lot more scaffolding on the launch mount, especially on the top deck, likely to work on the water-cooled layer on top. The launch mount has also gained some more protective panels on the exterior faces. But the most important addition of hardware lately has been the installation of the tubes that will supply water to the top of the deck of the launch mount. While the launch mount at Pad A is always roasted by the Raptors with each passing flight, Pad B's launch mount will have a water-cooled steel plate as its top layer, which will prevent it from getting roasted with each launch and landing. This is a very similar concept to how the current flame deflector works at Pad A, in that it's a big steel plate that's cooled with water. What's still unclear though is whether this top deck of this new launch mount will be a closed system with no water flowing out, or if it'll be an open system like Pad A's flame deflector. However, one thing that we do know now is that Pad B will no longer have the same flame deflector system as Pad A. Instead, it will support a more traditional, but still huge, flame diverter inside of a flame trench. That diverter is being built at the Sanchez lot as well, and it appears SpaceX has started installing the pipes that make up this giant structure. The pipes will allow water to flow through the diverter, cooling it and protecting it from the forces of the launch. At the end of the day, the most efficient way of protecting launch hardware from the energies of launch is simply by using water. Now, to switch things up a bit, it's worth mentioning that there has also been progress on Starship hardware right here in Florida. If you've been following along our social media and watched last week's episode of This Week in Spaceflight, you'd know exactly what I'm talking about. Just 3 miles away from me to the east, SpaceX teams have been working relentlessly on new foundations for the new launch mount that will be paired with the Starship launch facility at 39A. For the last couple of weeks, we've seen a drilling rig working at the site, rebar being laid down, and a whole lot more. And just a few miles to the south of me, at SpaceX's Roberts Road complex, the company continues its massive expansion to the north, with loads of ground clearing already been completed. For reference, the area for this next expansion is about as big as the entirety of the Starbase production site. And that's just the first phase. In the not too distant future, there's a second phase of this expansion planned to grow this facility even further. Until recently, we could only speculate that this expansion was for Starship production, but now we've seen documentation from SpaceX and the FAA noting a large building to be constructed in the area. This building, named Mega Bay, is said to be approximately 110 meters wide, 130 meters in length, and 115 meters tall. For reference, this building would be big enough to fit a handful of Starship full stacks horizontally, and about 3/4 the size of the VAB itself behind me. As a little teaser, I can say that we are gearing up for our next Space Coast flyover here soon. The weather here, just like in Starbase, has not been favorable this week in Florida, but as soon as it improves, we'll be airborne. So be sure to keep that in mind, because soon we'll be able to spot all of that Starship hardware up close. A lot can happen in just 1 week, so we'll see you back here next Monday and check back in. I'm Max Evans with NSF, and thanks for tuning in.